Today we're going to be chatting about Monk and Robot. This is a set of 2 books. You can tell by the size of the book that these are 2 very short books in a duology. The first book is called A Solemn for the Wild Built, and the second book is called A Prayer for the Crown Shy. I am very excited to be reviewing Monk and Robot because I absolutely love this duology. This is my second time reading the series, and I loved it just as much as the first time, maybe even a little bit more. Before I continue, I do want to say, while there aren't really things to spoil in these books, I will be talking about the plot, the characters, etc. So if you want to be more of a blank slate going into these books, I'd recommend leaving this video and coming back once you've read them. This is what I would call cozy sci-fi, a soft sci-fi because there's no real science in it. I guess you could also classify it as cozy fantasy. Most sci-fi that I read and that I gravitate towards, they're very dystopian, they're very bleak. They have a lot of commentary about our failings as a human race. This book is different because it is very hopeful and optimistic. This is a very cozy read, and nothing really happens in this book, so that's why it's different from a lot of the books that I'm drawn to. I find I am rather drawn to plot-driven books, but sometimes plot-driven books are a bit like candy. You enjoy it while eating it, tastes really good, but afterwards you don't really feel satiated. You still feel like you need a meal. So plot-driven books are a little like that for me. This is not a plot-driven book. As I mentioned, nothing really happens in this book. This is more of a character-driven book, if you will. But beyond that, it's kind of a study on philosophical questions, and it doesn't really provide any answers. When I curl up with this book, though, I feel a sense of coziness. I feel a sense of wonder and awe. I think it's the setting too. There are a lot of nature components in this book, and I'm learning that I really love that about books. I also love science fiction that has a first contact element, which this has, because sibling Dex, who is a tea monk, they are essentially on a journey to find themselves, and as they're embarking on what I would call a pilgrimage, they encounter a sentient robot from the factory age. So the robots in this book are, I guess you would say, their own species. These robots were commissioned by people to work in these factories, and they somehow attained consciousness. So when that happened, they were set free by the humans, and there was this parting promise that humans wouldn't venture out to find the robots. The robots were kind of just left to do their own thing. So Dex encounters one of these robots centuries later. Its name is Moscap. Moscap was actually seeking to make contact with humans again and happened to come across sibling Dex. What ensues is a really delightful exchange of these 2 creatures getting to know each other, trying to understand one another. I found myself chuckling at multiple points in this book. Moscap is very curious and inquisitive and has a lot of questions for sibling Dex, and Dex finds a lot of these questions difficult to answer. Some of these are little questions about objects or habits and routines and such, but they also get into some really interesting conversations about consciousness, about purpose, about the very human tendency to think that we're above or better than other creatures, animals, plants, robots. It's a meandering read, very, very cozy, but it has a lot of what I thought were thought-provoking passages and discussions that made me think a little bit about my own life. I have similar questions, whether humans do each have a specific purpose or whether that is a construct that we've created for ourselves because of our big egos. So that is something that I think about a lot, actually, like quite a lot. And this book, while I didn't really settle on any specific answer, it helped me think about things in a different way, and it helped me be okay with the fact that maybe I am fine just the way I am. Maybe I don't need a grand purpose. I also found it very well written, very comforting, and just a joy to read. You can probably tell by the way I'm talking about this book and the way I'm like hugging this book to my chest that I would give both of these books or this entire duology, Monk and Robot, 5 stars. So I really, really, really love this book, and I'm very nervous to react to the reviews on Goodreads. The first thing I'll mention is that the edition of the book that I have, the duology in one book, it's not on this list of books when I search for Monk and Robot. Instead, the 2 individual books come up in the Monk and Robot duology. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the reviews for A Prayer for the Crown Shy. I figure the majority of the people who read the second book started with the first book, so I'm thinking these reviews will have a little more information about them, maybe reference the first book or the entire series as a whole. The genres are sci-fi, fantasy, novella, because these books are quite short individually, queer, LGBT, and of course cozy. Once again, we're going to sort by newest reviews in English. I should have mentioned this in that first portion of the video with my overall thoughts, but one of the central themes in this book is friendship, and I loved the friendship between sibling Dex and Mosscap. It was a friendship that grew slowly over the time they shared on the road, on the pilgrimage, and then eventually sibling Dex taking Mosscap to meet different communities. They learn from each other, they bounce ideas off of each other, they have a mutual respect for each other. It was just such a wholesome, sweet, beautiful relationship. I found it really touching, and that's what brought a tear to my eye in many different sections of the book. And I also will say here that the first book is more about that first contact that I talked about, whereas the second book is where they re-enter civilization, and sibling Dex takes Mosscap to many different regions in Panga, and Mosscap meets and talks to people in all of these different communities. I loved both books. If I had to choose a favorite, maybe I would like the first book a tiny bit more, like a touch more, just because I love solitude, I love the idea of a pilgrimage, and I love first contact. The second book has more action because there are more characters. There's more that happens in the second book, and it's also got a beautiful ending. All right, Nikki's review. I will never be who I was before reading this series. I think this is something good. Isn't this the true purpose of literature, to see yourself in the characters, learn and grow? I would agree with this. I feel like I learned a lot about myself while reading this book, especially with my questions around purpose and around being enough, even if I'm not always doing. I really saw myself a lot in sibling Dex and in their journey. That feeling of wanting more, wanting to find meaning, wanting to be of service, and also that feeling of not putting that pressure on other people, but feeling that pressure internally for myself. There was a lot about sibling Dex's journey that really resonated with me. Nathan starts off this review with a few of the questions that are in this book. What is it you need? That is Mosscap's central question for the humans that it encounters. And in this world, they have solved a lot of the issues that were plaguing humanity. They have found a way to live sustainably, and everyone in this world seems to have had their fundamental needs met. So because robots haven't seen humans for centuries, when Mosscap approaches sibling Dex, it asks them, what is it that you need and how can I help? And that is the central question that Mosscap is seeking the answer to in all of its discussions with the different humans that it encounters. So that is the central question that's in this book, and it's a question that I have a very hard time answering. What is it that I need? I think the sentence in Nathan's review really hits on why I love this book so much, why it's a 5-star book for me. A touching reflection on humanity and purpose. If you've ever felt lost or unsure or misguided, this book will hit your feelings hard and fill your heart with everything you could ever want. 2 great reviews to start off my foray into Goodreads. Let's see if there's one more. Here's a 5-star review that touches on the use of pronouns in this book. P.S. on the usage of they. I feel the author paid much more attention in this installment on using they as reference to the monk versus referring to Monk and Robot. Here never gets confusing on who is the subject. You may have noticed that in this review I have referred to sibling Dex as they and Mosscap as it. These are the pronouns that they use in the book. So sibling Dex uses they them pronouns and Moscap uses the pronoun it. Let's move on to the 4-star reviews. Busy writes, I think I definitely liked the first book a little better, but 4.5 stars. It's not childish necessarily, but it is the most clear and basic explanation of how life is supposed to be. I've said this in previous reviews, but I really appreciate books that are easy to read. I love books that are written in a rather straightforward manner. I don't really like writing that has too much flourish in it or is too difficult to read. If I have to keep rereading a sentence over and over again to get the gist of it, that pulls me out of the story. I like to be able to read and understand books very quickly. So I think this book was very well written, but it was also a very simple and straightforward read, which is what I think makes it cozy as well. Magda writes, my favorite robot and human duo. I love the relationship between sibling Dex and Moscap. It just makes me smile. I just love the way they interacted. And for some reason, I never thought about AI when I was reading about Moscap. And Magda goes on to write, making me feel so seen. I related to this book hard. There were so many parts where I was like, oh my gosh, I thought I was the only person who felt this way. And of course, I know intellectually that I'm not the only person who feels anything. There are so many people in this world that of course, I'm not unique in that way, but when you come across a book by an author that doesn't know who is going to be reading the book, there is a sense of connectedness. I'm like, oh, Becky Chambers has these thoughts just like I do. So I did feel quite seen when reading this book. Next, a 4-star review by Jordan. I really fell in love with these characters and found the deeper message explored in these books to be so interesting. Both of these books just feel so cozy and had me giggling to myself at certain points. I 100% agree, and that goes back to what I said about this being a character-driven book. I think that is how I fell in love with the characters as well. Let's now move on to the 3-star reviews. Here's another review from someone who preferred the first book. I'm finding this interesting because the second book actually got a higher average rating. I really like this part of Faye's review. Dex and Moscap's adventures are like little fables, giving you something upon which to ponder and explore each time. This reviewer nailed it. Each chapter is like a little fable, and there are quite a lot of time jumps in this book. That's why the book can be so short, but still cover the entire pilgrimage, along with all of the travel to different communities. So I did like dropping in and seeing what Moscap and sibling Dex were up to, and they did feel like little fables with a little message, a little nugget to ponder. Here is another reviewer who preferred the first book, and Roro writes, it felt a little more disconnected. I'm not sure if that is why I liked the first book a little bit more. I wouldn't say I felt disconnected in the second book, but there was just more going on. I agree that it didn't have the same charm as the first book, and I think that's because in the first book, Moscap and sibling Dex meet for the first time, and it was so interesting to see them getting to know each other. The second book, their agenda was so packed, they had so many people to meet. They also spent a lot of their time away from each other. They would be in the same community, but Moscap would be off doing its own thing, and sibling Dex would be doing their own thing. Always returned to each other at some point because they were traveling together, but maybe there wasn't as much connection between the two main characters, so it felt a little more disconnected. For me though, the second book really brought up a lot of my anxieties about having too much on the schedule, being the center of attention, being in crowds, meeting new people. All of that felt very out of my comfort zone, so even though it still was a very cozy and comforting read, it was a little less so for me than the first book. That said, there were a lot of nuggets in the second book, and I've already talked about how much I loved the ending. It was an open-ended ending, but I thought it was really playful and fun and a little bit rebellious, so I really loved that as well. I thought this review by Lewis was interesting. 3-star review. Yes, it is so refreshing and genuinely utopian, but at the same time, it just comes across as her giving a tour on how to run a society 101. Someone on here said it's cloying and saccharine, which is true. But it's also then got insightful and wholesome takes on our duty to do good to others, our community, and our land as a whole. I can understand this review. I think utopian worlds aren't for everyone because it's just so far removed from the world we live in. It's hard to imagine a world where people get along, where we use sustainable materials, where we care about the environment, because it doesn't seem like the world is going in that direction. But I find the world that Becky Chambers built very hopeful and optimistic, and that to me makes me feel good. Is it sweet? Yes, but I like sweet. So I can see someone who doesn't like sweet quite as much saying that it's cloying and saccharine, but for me, it's like the perfect amount of sweet. Next, we're going to move into 2-star reviews, and I'm getting a little nervous because I love this book so much. This is an interesting review by Richie, a lot of telling me. So yes, because there are a lot of philosophical discussions and not a lot of things happening in the book, I would say that there is a lot of telling in this book. The reviewer goes on to write, I get why people say it's cozy, but I don't necessarily think that's a good thing. The cozy feeling I got was mostly from the lack of conflict and any interesting ideas really being fleshed out. So first thing I want to say is that cozy isn't for everyone. Some people don't enjoy cozy books, and that is totally okay. We all have different preferences. I don't always gravitate towards cozy books, although I do enjoy them. They usually leave me feeling like, okay, that was good, but nothing spectacular. I don't think I've enjoyed a cozy read as much as this one. But the cozy feeling I got wasn't from the lack of conflict, and I actually think there were a lot of interesting ideas being fleshed out. There wasn't a resolution, but there was a discussion which really activated my brain and made me think about a lot of different things. The cozy feeling, though, that I got was from the setting and from the pacing and from the meandering, the pilgrimage. I loved the references to nature, and particularly in the second book, I looked up images of crown shyness, and this does exist in our world. And it was so interesting because Mosscap pointed out the crown shyness, and sibling Dex looked up and marveled at this phenomenon, but they couldn't remember ever seeing it before, even though it was the area that they were very familiar with because it was where they grew up with their family. So not only did I find crown shyness very interesting, I also found it interesting and also very profound that there are a lot of things in our immediate environment that we don't notice because we're just busy living our day-to-day lives. The next 2-star review is by Kim. I was mostly bored, and if it were a longer book, I would not have continued it. I could definitely see why some people would find this book boring, and I would say that this book is the perfect length. It left me wanting more, but I don't think it needed to be longer. I still would have finished it if it were longer because I personally loved the book, but I think it being longer would have taken away some of the magic and some of the charm of this book. I was sad when this book was done. I wanted it to go on, but I think that is a good thing. It's the worst when you're reading a book and you're like, okay, this has gone on long enough. When is it going to end? And books that finish where you want to keep reading, where you want to know what happens next, I think they are wrapping up at exactly the right place. This 2-star review by Doug says, compared to the first book in the series, this one was too sugary, sappy. Everyone seems happy, inclusive, open, accepting, everyone, all the time. Okay, so I have 2 things to say about this. The first is that that's not necessarily true. There was a community that Dex and Mosscap went to where they weren't open and inviting. This was a community that went back to its roots with no technology, and a lot of people in the community weren't happy to see Mosscap because Mosscap is a robot and it is essentially technology embodied. So the people in this community did not come out to greet Mosscap. There was no resolution of that. They didn't suddenly come around and embrace Mosscap. They essentially shuttered their doors. They pulled children away from windows. So there are still people who aren't open and accepting and inclusive. As well, Sibling Dex works as a tea monk, and people come to them with a lot of day-to-day issues. So I don't think this book paints humanity as always being happy. Humans will always have struggles, even if they have everything they need. They're tired, they might have disagreements, there's moodiness, there's all the ups and downs that come with being human. So these books still include all of that. Here's a 1-star review by Sharko. If you read only the first one, you may be able to overlook the abysmal pacing, but do not fear, the total lack of conflict, character development, world building is extremely evident. I don't agree with this review at all. I thought the pacing was fantastic. I wouldn't even call it slow pacing. Because I read so many plot-driven books and pacing is a big deal for me in those types of books, I really liked that in this book, because nothing really happens, I'm not rushing to find out what happens next. The other thing I want to say about the pacing, though, that I personally really loved is what I talked about before in terms of the little time jumps. So we would have a scene, and then we would have a scene maybe like a week later or whatnot. We're essentially dropped in to check on what sibling Dex and Mosscap are up to. So I thought that made for a really well-paced book. I also wouldn't say that there was a lack of conflict. The conflict that I noticed in this book was really more of an internal or philosophical type of conflict. It's something that I grapple with myself, so maybe that's why I find it so relatable. It's not external conflict in the way of, say, I need to get from point A to point B, but there are all these obstacles in the way, and the book is about me overcoming these obstacles. The obstacles are really within myself. I could see if someone didn't relate to these characters, but I thought these characters were very well developed. I understood their personalities. Dex is still pretty young in this book. I think they're in their 20s, but we still got a little bit of their backstory, and we got to meet their family in the second book. Although we don't meet any other robots, we get a sense of Mosscap's backstory as well, just through their conversations. So I thought the character development was actually quite good given how short the book was and how much it was also focused on these philosophical questions. I found myself feeling really connected with these characters to the point, as I mentioned, that I teared up in multiple places. Lack of world building is interesting to me because I thought the world was also pretty well developed. The reviewer writes, Chambers created an interesting world and two interesting characters, then proceeded to do close to no world building or characterization on either. I was disappointed more than anything. It sounds like this reviewer wanted to know more about these characters and more about the world, and I can relate to that because I too wanted to know more. I wouldn't say I had a lot of questions about the world or about the characters, but because I loved these books so much, I really wanted to know more. That's a little different from this reviewer because I think this reviewer needed more in order to give the book a good review, so what was there wasn't enough for this reader, whereas what was in the books was enough for me. There's a lot in this review, but I'm just going to pick out a couple of points. The first being that this reviewer can't shake the thought of a robot that behaves like a child and asks stupid questions about the world we live in, questions it should already know the answers to because it lacks consciousness and thinks in an analytical way. I think there's a typo somewhere in this review because the robot does have consciousness. The book actually explains this. It's been centuries now that robots and humans have lived in separate parts of this world. They've had no contact with each other. The robots aren't like all connected with each other. There's no internet connection among these robots. They're not plugged into any like central mainframe. So they don't actually share knowledge in that way. Instead, they leave messages for each other and they have periodic gatherings. Mosscap is also a descendant of the original factory robots, but knowledge isn't passed down in that way. Very similar to how a human grandchild wouldn't have the same consciousness as a grandparent. So I don't know why this reviewer thinks that Mosscap should already know everything about the way humans are living. They've had no contact for centuries and they don't pass on knowledge in that way. We really have to set aside what we think we know about robots because robots in this world might not conform to what we expect robots to be. So if you imagine first contact, neither party knows anything about each other. And what is the easiest way to get to know each other, especially if you have a shared language? It's to ask questions. And of course, the questions are going to be basic at first. It is going to be a childlike conversation. But similar to how Mosscap asks questions as though it were a child, sibling Dex's questions also come from a place where they could be seen as a child because they know nothing about the robots. The other point that really got to this reviewer is the whole they-them situation. I don't understand why the main character has to be referred to as they. This is strange to me on many different levels, but I'm going to bring it back to language. And coming from a Chinese background, I speak Cantonese and we don't use gender pronouns in our language. In Cantonese, if I wanted to refer refer to a person, regardless of their gender, I would say ko. So I would use that word ko to refer to my husband, say. I would also use that same word ko to refer to my sister. So using they, them as a singular pronoun doesn't seem that unusual to me. That is going to be my review of Monk and Robot. I love this duology so much, and it's one of the fiction books that I actually purchased for my home. I don't own a lot of fiction at all, and I am just so happy to have this book so I can read it over and over again, which I do plan to do. If you've read the Monk and Robot series, I would love to hear your thoughts. Please leave me a comment down below. That is going to be it for today. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I will see you very soon in the next one. Until then, please take care and bye for now.